The Vietnam War was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Cold War. Vietnam was split up into two nations, North Vietnam, controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communists, and South Vietnam, a capitalist country run by a series of dictators. The West had its hand in former Indochina since France tried to retake it in their ill-fated war, with the US funding France's involvement before they were eventually kicked out. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the United States officially began sending ground troops to Vietnam to aid the South in their war effort. So began a brutal counterinsurgency operation waged by South Vietnam and its allies, where they struggled to identify friend from foe, and many civilians were caught in the crossfire. Prominent massacres like My Lai would occur, but these massacres were not aberrations, but rather the culmination of policies and practices the US military engaged in during the war. From basic training for soldiers, to policies like free fire zones and the use of body count as a measure of success, the murder of civilians by US troops was endemic and systemic to their conduct in the war. This video will analyze these key aspects of US involvement in the Vietnam War, and argue that they contributed not just to prominent massacres, but also to a culture and system that legitimized the murder of innocents throughout the course of the conflict. Soldiers who volunteered or were drafted into the US Army or Marine Corps during Vietnam all had to undergo basic training to get them battle ready. Recruits were indoctrinated into a culture of violence and brutality. As soon as they stepped off the bus at boot camp, they were abused by their drill instructor, told they would be killed, and signified their intention to destroy the recruits' civilian attributes. Ron Kovic, a Marine Corps sergeant, recounts that his drill sergeant told recruits, quote, "I want you maggots to wash all that civilian scum off your bodies forever." Life in basic training was highly regimented, and encouraged recruits to be compliant and conformist. In one instance, a chaplain told his recruits in an Orwellian fashion that, quote, "The free soldier is the one who willingly submits to authority." Many drill instructors went off script and implemented their own unofficial methods of heightening aggression amongst their trainees, like impromptu drills. Throughout their training, soldiers were told to kill, 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 and with racism towards the Vietnamese, this created a dangerous combination. The Vietnamese, the enemy, were rarely ever referred to as Vietnamese, and often reduced to primitive racist terms accompanied with a variety of racial slurs. Furthermore, there was little to no distinction made between South Vietnamese, the allies the US were coming to the aid of, and the North Vietnamese, the enemy. The soldiers themselves were often the victim of verbal abuse based on class, religion, race, or physical appearance. While the enemy was dehumanized, so were the recruits, but it was always made clear that the enemy were below them. And while the epithets used against recruits almost paradoxically served to unite them as they were all being insulted, they still retained their poison against the foreign enemy. Military training made no distinction between civilians and Viet Cong, and soldiers were often told that all Vietnamese were potential enemies. As previously mentioned, their training also taught them that civilian characteristics were weak, and by extension, civilians were weak, and this promoted increased hostility towards non-combatants by soldiers. Trainees in boot camp or soldiers in country received at most a 1-hour lecture on the laws of war and on war crimes, but this paled in comparison to the weeks upon weeks of training they had received to mold them into merciless killing machines. The combination of these factors, from the dehumanizing training US soldiers received at boot camp, to the racist language used against the enemy and the hostility instilled in soldiers towards civilians, led to a toxic culture in the armed forces, and would help contribute to the murder of innocent civilians throughout the conflict. Once these brutalized trainees were shipped to Vietnam, they entered a radically different environment, and a war that was a massive departure to the ones previous generations had fought. This war lacked clearly defined front lines, enemies without uniforms, and a population that was either indifferent or openly hostile to their presence. Facing this difficulty, MACV, short for Military Assistance Command Vietnam, along with the South Vietnamese authorities, set up strategic hamlets, guarded towns designed to restrict the flow of Viet Cong supplies and limit their influence. Outside of these strategic hamlets were free fire zones. Free fire zones were defined in Field Manual FM 620 as a specific designated area into which any weapon system may fire without additional coordination with the establishing headquarters. In effect, this meant that anyone who moved in these zones at certain times of the day, or in some zones 24/7, could be assumed hostile and fired upon without any repercussions, even if it turned out the person killed was not Viet Cong. This policy did not care for everyday South Vietnamese villagers, who were told that they must travel via approved routes to avoid these free fire zones. These routes often proved to be much longer and more arduous than what they were used to, forcing civilians to brave the free fire zones to get to and from their village as quickly as possible. Many villagers were also illiterate and could not read the warning signs, travelling into free fire zones by mistake. Others did not want to leave their villages, which contained everything they had, including their possessions, farms, livestock, and livelihood, and many had strong ancestral ties to their villages and hamlets. If US or ARVN troops caught people in these zones, they often attacked with overwhelming force, firing rifles, machine guns, grenades, and even calling in artillery fire missions. US pilots who missed their intended targets on a sortie would often search for a free fire zone and drop their payload there, hoping to hit something. In 1966, 65% of all artillery and bombs were used for harassment and interdiction, dropping to 45% in 1967, meaning that most bombs dropped were not used against military targets. While many mistakes were genuinely made, with US soldiers mistaking civilians for Viet Cong, others took advantage of this policy to commit atrocities and get away with it. Soldiers soon realized that they could kill small numbers of civilians, log them as VC, and not have this raise any eyebrows up the chain of command. As one anonymous Marine explained, when civilians got killed, no problem. Just stick a Chi-Com grenade on them, or an AK, they become VC. The zones themselves were often designated by South Vietnamese province chiefs, who would designate areas as communist-controlled based on their own personal grievances. The creation and implementation of free fire zones, combined with the emphasis on body count as a measure of success, as I will examine next, led to the indiscriminate killing of thousands of civilians. And while it is difficult to gather an accurate figure, Gunter Louis, a German-American author, estimated that roughly one-third of those killed and counted as enemy KIA by Southern forces were civilians, roughly 220,000 people, whose deaths these free fire zones contributed greatly towards. Robert McNamara was appointed Secretary of Defense by then-President John F. Kennedy in January 1961, a position he would continue to serve in after Lyndon B. Johnson became president. McNamara served in World War II and held an important role in the Air Force, being responsible in part for organization and analysis of the US's bombing campaigns over Europe and the Pacific, working directly with Curtis LeMay. As Defense Secretary, he played a crucial role in coordinating America's war effort following the insertion of US ground troops in 1965. McNamara was a technocrat through and through, believing that everything could be mapped to a chart, be analyzed by an equation, and have its own data point. He fully embraced this philosophy when shaping the Vietnam War, through adopting body count and kill-death ratios as the ultimate measure of success. An interaction between a Marine colonel and the Defense Secretary in Da Nang in 1965 elucidates McNamara's philosophy of war. One particular visit seemed to sum it up. McNamara looking for the war to fit his criteria, his definitions. He went to Da Nang in 1965 to check on the Marine progress there. A Marine colonel in I Corps had a sand table showing the terrain and patiently gave the briefing. Friendly situation, enemy situation, main problem. McNamara watched it, not really taking it in. His hands folded, frowning a little, finally interrupting. "Now let me see," McNamara said. "If I have it right, this is your situation." And then he spouted his own version, all in numbers and statistics. The colonel, who was very bright, read him immediately, and without changing stride went on with the briefing, simply switching his terms, quantifying everything in numbers and percentages up, percentages down, so blatant a performance that it was like a satire. The purpose of America's war, as McNamara and US MACV Commander General William Westmoreland believed, was less to eliminate North Vietnam but to prop up and maintain South Vietnam's independence and existence. The way to achieve this was to kill the enemy at a rate high enough that they could not replace their losses, and this became the ultimate measure of success, the elusive crossover rate. This was communicated down the chain of command and drilled into soldiers at all levels. Unit commanders had an immense amount of pressure to produce body counts, and units competed with one another over who could tag the most bodies. Philip Caputo, a former Marine officer, writes in his book the following: General Westmoreland's strategy of attrition also had an important effect on our behaviour. Our mission was not to win terrain or seize positions, but simply to kill communists and as many of them as possible, stack them like cordwood. Victory was a high body count, defeat a low kill ratio, war a matter of arithmetic. The pressure on unit commanders to produce enemy corpses was intense, and they in turn communicated it to their troops. This led to such practices as counting civilians as Viet Cong. If it's dead in Vietnamese, it's VC, was our rule of thumb in the bush. It is not surprising, therefore, that some men acquired a contempt for human life and predilection for taking it. Killing was a central focus of American policy and the core of the war of attrition they were waging. Soldiers were sometimes promised rewards of extra leave for higher body counts. The natural conclusion of this approach to warfare was the enormous inflation of statistics. Commanders exaggerated body counts, with one study estimating that these counts were exaggerated by up to 100%. It was a complete farce, and many American officers knew this. US soldiers would go out on search and destroy missions, report large numbers of enemy KIA, but only recover a handful of weapons. For example, during Operation White Wing in the Anlau Valley, over a 6-week period, the US and Arvin forces reported 5,576 enemy casualties, but only recovered 354 weapons. The entire premise of the war was a sham, and many Vietnamese civilians suffered unjustly for it. Not only were commanders often lying about body counts, but now they were given tacit approval to lump in civilians into these body counts. Nick Turse describes one particular incident in his book. On September 1, 1969, members of the 196th Infantry Brigade in Quang Tin Province spotted a group of Vietnamese. Officers and sergeants peering through binoculars conferred about the situation. After about 10 minutes of observation, the senior officer, Captain David Janker, ordered his machine gunners to open fire and called in an artillery fire mission. A small patrol was then dispatched to the kill zone. Patrol member Welke Louis described the scene. I observed about 4 or 6 Vietnamese children lying in one pile, dead. About 5 meters from the position were 2 or 3 other Vietnamese children huddled together. Afterwards, artillery forward observer Robert Volz told army investigators that he saw an official document in which the dead were listed as VC. Soldiers began to recognize the contradiction and often outright ignored or broke rules of engagement as they believed that it put their lives in danger. US soldiers, even those who wanted to minimize civilian casualties, were caught in a web of lies. It further made them resent the very people they were sent to Vietnam to protect, and this made it difficult for these soldiers to differentiate between friend and foe. The inevitable consequence of this, the body count obsession, their training, and the legal immunity to kill anything in a free fire zone, was large-scale massacres like the infamous My Lai. On the 16th of March 1968, soldiers of the US Army approached the village of My Lai, expecting to come into contact with Viet Cong Local Force 48th Battalion. However, when they approached the village, they received no incoming fire. Once entering the village, the troops were surprised to find no enemies whatsoever. They had gone in expecting a fight. 2 days earlier, March 14th, these men of Charlie Company 1st Battalion 35th Infantry had rampaged through several hamlets after one of their soldiers stepped on a landmine, killing one and wounding 2 others. Then almost instantaneously there was an explosion of violence, with US forces opening fire on civilians. Anything that ran was fired upon. Soldiers threw grenades into houses and civilians were marshaled to nearby irrigation ditches and shot dead. By the end of the slaughter, 504 civilians were killed, although the US Army only officially recognizes 347 dead. While the massacre received significant media attention, this only started about 18 months after the massacre, in November 1969, and by the end of the war crimes tribunals, no soldier convicted served his full sentence. The killings were stopped only by helicopter pilot Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr., who was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and his 2 crew members awarded Bronze Stars. My Lai was not an aberration, and a natural conclusion of the aforementioned policies of the US military. It was an atmosphere where killing was normalized and encouraged. Little distinction was made between friend and foe, and such emotions and mentality would inevitably lead to an explosion of violence and mass slaughter. Several soldiers involved in the killings testified that they were given the order to kill and destroy everything in the village. Right after the killings, Westmoreland congratulated the soldiers for the high number of enemy casualties, who were initially logged as communist forces. My Lai was not the only massacre US forces committed, and the nature of the war saw similar atrocities, albeit on a smaller scale and occurring daily throughout the war. Slaughter became endemic to US conduct in the Vietnam War. A combination of soldiers training, free fire zones, and body counts as a measure of success led to wanton murder of innocent civilians and an inflation of body counts. The ultimate conclusion of these policies was the My Lai Massacre, where hundreds of Vietnamese civilians were killed in a single day by US forces, and initially counted as Viet Cong, before the true story came out. Soldiers were not only encouraged but also rewarded to produce body counts, encouraging them to not only kill, but to chalk up civilian deaths as enemies, with some historians estimating that up to 10% or even more of North Vietnamese casualties reported were not enemies but civilians. Vietnamese lives were treated as worthless, And while not every single unit and soldier in the US military committed war crimes, the consequences of the mantra, kill anything that moves, was natural. Thanks for watching.